In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls, O good one. Amen. So welcome to everybody tonight. This first class will be on the subject of how worldview impacts architecture and the environment. And as you can see, it's a class that really needs visuals, which is why it needs to be presented this way, because the visuals are a huge part of what's being conveyed. So immediately we're struck by these four images, which tie into the subject matter of the lecture. We have the St. Basil's Cathedral on the top left, and then we have a beautiful field on the right-hand corner. And then we also have a really ugly building, I think from Poland, inspired by communist architecture on the bottom left. And then we have a trash pile on the bottom right. So I'm not going to go into detail on that because that's what we're going to unpack the meaning of this as we go forward. So I want to begin by using a quote from an Orthodox philosopher by the name of Philip Sherrard. And he was an ecologist and also a translator of the Philokalia into English. Very influential Orthodox philosopher. One could call him a theologian, but I prefer not to use that term for non-saints. But he was a deep thinker, and this is something he had to say about his perspective on the issue of the environment and ecology. He says that our model of the universe, our world picture or world image, is based upon the model that we have of ourselves, upon our own self-image. When we look at the world, what we see is a reflection of our own mind, of our own mode of consciousness. Our perception of a tree, a mountain, a face, an animal, a bird, is a reflection of our idea of who we think we are. What we experience in these things is not so much the reality or nature of these things in themselves as simply that which our own limitations, spiritual, psychological, and physical, permit us to experience of them. And according to Sherrard, the heart of the problem is having desanctified ourselves in our own minds, we have desanctified nature too in our own minds. So essentially, he says we have ruined the world, and here's an example of pollution desecrating the world, because we have desecrated ourselves first and foremost. So it's really a problem of what's going on inside of us, which causes us to treat the world in a particular way. So here's a quote from William Shakespeare: "Fine tongues in trees, books in running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything." So this would suggest a more sacramental worldview in which you see the world as a place imbued with meaning, a message from the Creator, and there's sermons, and there's information, and there's good in everything that is in the created world. So to kind of lay the foundation before we go into examining particular examples, we'll take a look at the theology of St. Maximus the Confessor, who gives us the Orthodox perspective on cosmology, which is basically our view of the world. And so he says that there are these things, these principles, or these ideas and things called logoi. And he says the logoi are God's original ideas or intentions for creation. And he says they are unifying, ordering, and determinative and defining principles in accordance with which God institutes created natures. A thing's being, what it is determined by its logos, by what God intends it to be. So again, logoi are God's original ideas for all created things. And they all speak of the logos, who is Christ himself. So To put it more simply, the creation speaks of the Creator. And so we have an icon of Christ on the left, who is stretching out his hand in blessing, and he is creating all living things as the logos. But each one of these living things has its own logos, its own meaning, its own purpose, its own intention for why it exists. So this is a sacramental worldview. This is how the church sees the construction of the entire universe. So St. Sergius built the Church of the Holy Trinity as a mirror for his community, that through gazing at the divine unity, they might overcome the hateful divisions of this world. This is a quote from the Russians and their church. So here we have a beautiful Orthodox church on the right, the Church of the Holy Trinity. This goes back to probably the 12th or 14th century, depending on when it was reconstructed. And this church is meant to be a reflection of God, a reflection of unity in freedom, which is a theme St. Sergius of Rodonezh spoke of often, because the Holy Trinity is that divine community which shares love and communion with one another. And so the church itself is meant to be that living icon and example for people to look upon and inspire them in this way. So another interesting thing which speaks to the way we understand construction and architecture from a perspective of church is something we can see in Psalm 90. And this is taken from the service for blessing a new home. We would read this psalm at that time. He that dwelleth in the help of the Most High shall abide in the shelter of the God of heaven. So what I want you to do is notice the words that are chosen. So think about, okay, a house has just been constructed, and this would also be used for the construction of a church as well. And the psalm is very specifically chosen to make a connection between the dwelling place of the house or the building and how that building or structure relates to God. So again, we'll begin reading the psalm. He that dwelleth in the help of the Most High. So you dwell in a house, but it's the connection is being made between the dwelling of the house and dwelling in the help of the Most High. He shall abide in the shelter of the God of heaven. So abiding again in your house is being compared to abiding in the shelter of God. So again, shelter, God's shelter, the shelter that the house brings to you, sheltering you from the elements and so forth. He shall say unto the Lord, thou art my helper and my refuge. He is my God, and I will hope in him. So again, just as a home or any building is a place of refuge, God is also the ultimate refuge. For he shall deliver thee from the snare of the hunters and from every troubling word. With his shoulders will he overshadow thee, and under his wings shalt thou have hope. With his shield will his truth encompass thee. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day, nor for the thing that walks about in darkness, nor for the mishap and demon of noonday. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but unto thee shall it not come nigh. Only with thine eyes shalt thou behold, and thou shalt see the reward of sinners. For thou, O Lord, art my hope. Thou madest the Most High thy refuge. No evil shall come nigh to thee, and no scourge shall draw nigh into thy dwelling. For he shall give his angels charge over thee to keep thee in all thy ways. On their hand shall they bear thee up, lest at any time thou dash thy foot against a stone. Upon the asp and the basilisk shalt thou tread, and thou shalt trample upon the lion and the dragon. For he has set his hope on me, and I will deliver him. I will shelter him, because he hath known my name. He shall cry unto me, and I will hearken unto him. I am with him in affliction, and I will rescue him and glorify him. With length of days will I satisfy him, and I will show him my salvation. So you can see the wording here is making this connection between the things that we build and the way that they are imaging to us the ultimate building which God has built, which is the creation itself, and then further than that, God's own being, his own protection of us as the one who is the true shelter, the true refuge, the one under whom we dwell. So that's a sacramental idea of construction, building, and what is the deeper meaning of things. And so it speaks to this idea of transcendence. And so you have the way the church is constructed is, there's the part underneath, and then there's the part above. And the part above is really the part that is where the dome is and the cross. It's asking our eyes to ascend. It's drawing our attention upward towards that which is beyond this world. And it's very intentional. So we'll continue to explore this. So, if you look at somebody like Tolkien, you can see that he uses architecture also to convey ideas, because architecture is very powerful in the way it makes us feel, and it always has a message. So you can see right here in this article about Tolkien, it calls it a narrative shortcut. So it allows him to imply much about his imaginary people without explicitly saying it. So you can notice the contrast here between the shard edges on the left and the circles and the rolling hills on the right. So a very different kind of people dwell in the Shire and the Hobbit Hole than who dwell in this other place over here on the left. And it conveys something to you. The right is conveying, we'll talk more about the meaning of circles and what they're symbols of. But, there's these rolling hills, there's this, it's almost more like this feminine architecture. It's inviting, it's soft, it's homey. And then on the left, you have this kind of these sharp edges, and, it kind of looks like something you'd rather run away from, more like a prison. And it conveys sharpness, danger, violence. And this is all being said to us without using a single word. This is just what our eyes are telling us. So now we get to a little bit more of the meat of what we're going to be talking about, which is, there's spiritual architecture, and then there's fallen architecture. So the spiritual architecture, or noetic, coming from the word nous, which is the eye of the soul. This is kind of an example of before the fall, God was in perfect communion with humanity, with the spirit, and God's energies were directly feeding the nous, the spirit. And then the energies of God would flow from the spirit and feed the soul and the body. But after the fall, the whole thing was reversed. And so instead of drawing our life from God and our spirit being illumined, which then fed the rest of our being, we fell into a situation in which we now took our life from the world, from the ground. We had to work by the sweat of our brow, and we had to eat the things that grew out of the earth in order to keep our bodies alive, in order to keep our souls alive. And then in this sinful condition, the spirit is darkened, and it's no longer illumined. Well, Christ reversed all this, and through his incarnation, he restored us to that state before the fall. And that's what the process of repentance and sanctification is all about. But keep these images in mind. So if we can look at these two different buildings here, we can actually see that there's a direct example of this. So the top would be an example of architecture which reflects spirit, soul, and body in that order. And on the bottom, we would have an example of body, soul, and spirit at the very bottom. So we'll go a little more into the symbolism of squares and circles, because that's going to tie into the next couple slides. So squares represent the knowable world of creation, law, order, logic, balance, security and predictability, analysis, and science. And of course, that's perfectly good in its place. The square is that representation because it's got the four directions, north, south, east, west. The cross itself is an image of that as well, the four directions of the cross. But the square world represents this world. Anyways, more could be said about that, but we'll talk about that later. Circles represent totality, wholeness, perfection, eternity without beginning and without end. And there's a famous philosopher from the Middle Ages who said, God is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. So here we have an example of noetic architecture. So if you look at this church building, you see that the square is on the bottom. And so, as I just said, the square represents this world, the four directions, order, stability, predictability, security. It represents the earth. And then on top, you have the dome, which is a circular thing, and that represents eternity. It represents God because it has no beginning and it has no end. And it also represents God being the king who reigns over the creation, who reigns over the entire cosmos. And so also we can kind of see this in how we perceive the earth as this flat surface, even though we know, of course, it's round, but we perceive it as flat. And then we see the dome of the sky, which is over the earth. So it's kind of a reflection of creation, but also that circular dome on top represents the crown of God reigning over his creation. So this would be architecture which reflects that natural, divinely inspired order. Next slide. So this would be an example of atheist architecture during the communist era. And so, of course, we know that they rejected God. And what's very interesting about this example is that it's completely reversed. So instead of the square being at the bottom of the building and the circle being on the top, which looks much more natural to our eyes also, you have the square on top of the circle. So it's completely upside down. Well, aside from being completely hideous and it's not something that's pleasing to the eye, it's completely backwards. It's a reflection of something that has become disordered, and it reflects a worldview. Let's see, go back here real quick. Also, something else I wanted to say about this is that even the human body, the reason why this actually looks more pleasing to our eyes and more natural is because even the human body follows this pattern. So you have the square shoulders, which represents, our the lower part of our being, and then you have the circular head on top. So even a church building can also reflect the human body in that way. Okay, moving right along here. So communist architecture, building on this idea of, there is nothing more, there's nothing transcendent, there's nothing above us, there's nothing beyond the material world. It began to just eliminate anything that would suggest that. And, I would point out, for example, that even today in China, they're persecuting, there's a renewed persecution of Islam, Christianity, and even Buddhism. And they're actually going around, they're destroying Buddhist statues that have been in China for hundreds of years. And you might wonder, well, why are they doing this? Well, they're trying to destroy anything that would suggest to people that there's something more than this world, because if you want to control everyone, you have to get rid of that idea. You have to try to bring everybody into submission to, as the scriptures say, princes and sons of men, which we're told in whom there is no salvation. So it's a very intentional, in the architectural representation, there's an intentional cutting off of the upper portion. We no longer see the spiral at the top taking us out of this world and suggesting to us a world which transcends this one. So there's no unnecessary beauty. In fact, there's often an attempt to thwart the natural order of things. And then you can kind of see that taking place in these examples where it's just, this is a communist apartment complex here on the left. It just kind of looks unnatural. There's things sticking out in odd places. Over here on the top right, it's kind of clever. They've got these windows kind of falling off, but it doesn't really look right. And then down here on the lower right-hand corner, you've got these bubbles, and which it's nicer than the example on the left, but it's still rather awkward. So here's another communist apartment building, which is pretty gross. And the message here becomes, man is a cog in the machine. Beauty is forgotten. Religion is destroyed as impractical. You are not round. You are a block that can easily be stacked and counted. You can be made to fit within the non-mystery. And so Father Seraphim Rose says about the this kind of architecture. It is a cold, inhuman world that men are without God fashioning, a world where there is everywhere organization and efficiency, and nowhere love or reverence. The sterile purity and functionalism of contemporary architecture are a typical expression of such a world. So here we have that example of everyone is kind of squeezed into this easily controlled space. There's no unnecessary beauty, and everyone's stacked together. Here's another example here of, go back one. These are also more communist apartment complexes. And this is actually known as brutalist architecture. And you can see it looks pretty brutal also. It's very brutal on the eyes. Over here in the left-hand corner, that's an apartment complex in Zagreb. I believe that's Croatia, built during the communist era. Very bleak. There's no beauty, and it's brutal to the eyes. So the philosophy behind brutalism and constructivist architecture is explained here. So brutalism became synonymous with the socially progressive housing solutions that architects and town planners promoted as modern streets in the sky, with an ethos of social utopianism together with an influence of constructivist architecture. So architects hope that through constructivism, the spaces and monuments of the new socialist utopia, the ideal of which the Bolshevik revolution was waged, could be realized. So again, they're trying to use architecture of a way of conveying ideas. You know, it says something to you when you look at that building. It conveys a certain idea. And one of the ideas that's obviously conveyed is that, you know, it doesn't lift your mind up towards heaven. You know, it kind of subdues you and keeps you here in this present materialistic world. Not that the world is materialistic, but it keeps you down. Your gaze is not lifted up. It doesn't suggest to you that there's something more. So again, tying this into the idea of the Borg, you will be assimilated and resistance is futile, to make a Star Trek reference. It's not surprising that the square is used to represent man's control of man. An absence of circles and hierarchy is something that we see in that kind of architecture. You know, the square again can be used easily. It's predictable. You can stack one upon another, and it also suggests an absence of the feminine quality. The feminine represents intuition, nature and nurture, relationship, knowing rather than knowing about. So that's an important theme we'll continue to explore. And you'll be surprised to know that the coming of the mechanistic age was prophesied quite a while ago. And this is an article written by Samuel Butler in 1863 called Darwin Among the Machines. And he says, you refer to the question, what sort of creature man's next successor in the supremacy of Earth is likely to be? We have often heard this debated, but it appears to us that we ourselves are creating our own successors. We are daily adding to the beauty and delicacy of their physical organization. We are daily giving them greater power and supplying by all sorts of ingenious contrivances that self-regulating, self-acting power, which will be to them what intellect has been to the human race. In the course of ages, we shall find ourselves the inferior race. Day by day, however, the machines are gaining ground upon us. Day by day, we are becoming more subservient to them. More men are daily bound down as slaves to tend them. More men are daily devoting the energies of their whole lives to the development of mechanical life. The upshot is simply a question of time. But that the time will come when the machines will hold the real supremacy over the world and its inhabitants is what no person of a truly philosophic mind can for a moment question. So he continues to predict the coming of artificial intelligence. The article ends by saying and urging, war to the death should be instantly proclaimed against them. Every machine of every sort should be destroyed by the well-wishers of his species. Let there be no exceptions made, no quarter shown. Let us at once go back to the primeval condition of the race. There is no security, to quote his own words, against the ultimate development of mechanical consciousness. So interesting, it's kind of a long quote. I'm sorry for reading all that. But this was written in 1863. So already this person kind of saw the signs of the times and the spirit of the age, and they saw where things were leading. It was leading to the taking over of life by the machines. And that is the world that we are in the process of creating, sadly. And so I thought I'd throw Elon Musk in here, since he's, really into this sort of thing and wants to put computer chips in people's brains and so forth. A fascinating fellow. So we're already there. We have, if you're not familiar with Sophia is a social humanoid robot developed by the Hong Kong-based company Hanson Robotics. She was turned on February 14th, 2016, and made her first public appearance at South by Southwest Festival in Austin, Texas. She's been covered by the media around the globe, and she's been interviewed on lots of different television shows. She actually became a Saudi Arabian citizen, the first robot to receive citizenship of any country. She was also named the United Nations Development Programme's first ever innovation champion, and is the first non-human to be given any United Nations title. So here we have it. It's not in the future, somewhere 100 years from now. We already have a robot who's a citizen of a country and who has artificial intelligence and who can carry on conversations with people and so forth. So this is kind of comes into the issue of architecture, because architecture is related to creation. Why do we make things the way that we do? What's the purpose and what's the message behind them? The word architect itself means chief creator. So are we being imitators of the chief creator, or are we, instead of creating something else? There's a book called Darwin, Marx, and Wagner. And there's a quote from a gentleman named Proudhon in 1865. And he had this to say: "What governs the modern world is neither dogma, nor a faith, nor a tradition. It is not the gospel, nor the Quran, nor Aristotle, nor Voltaire. No more is it the Constitution. It is the great ledger, whose pages carry only two words in large letters. On the one side, debit, on the other side, credit." So there's some words about materialism, again, way back in 1865. So now, just to reflect on kind of what's contributed to where we are now and how many people saw it coming, this world of a mechanical world, materialistic world, a world where, the top has been cut off. And, I'm sorry, that was probably not a word. Top has been cut off, and we're left with just what's below. So let's examine also fascist architecture, which could also be called reactionary modernism. Fascist architecture is interesting because it's a little bit different than communist architecture, but notice the square. Again, notice that at least in this example, there's nothing on top. But what is different is that fascism was also trying to be, it's always trying to harken back to the past. So the glory days of what was. So if you look at the fascist movement of Mussolini in Italy, which is what this is an example of, or you look at Nazism, there's always this desire to create a modern world which brings back the glory of former days. It's deceptive, but of course, it can be very appealing to people. And so the difference here is you kind of see that in the architecture itself. It reflects that worldview. So you have the ancient structure of the arches, you even have the ancient statues, but notice how they're placed within the square. They're trying to contain, here's another view of it. So the past is now contained within the cube. So it's not really bringing back the classical world, which is impossible to do anyways, but there is this kind of desire to promote the idea that we can return to these glory days, but we're going to do it in this kind of new militaristic kind of a way. We're going to kind of squeeze the past into this new paradigm. So here's an example of what Berlin was going to be. This is the future utopian fascist city that Hitler wanted to build. This is a drawing from Albert Speer, which was Hitler's chief architect. And so the interesting thing to notice here is actually we do have things in the right order. We do actually have the square underneath, and we do have the dome on top, but there's something I want you to notice about the dome. Maybe you've already picked up on it. It is excessively oversized. And this suggests a problem, which is that there's this desire to invoke order, but it's too heavy-handed. You know, it's this top-down approach, but it's not the way churches are constructed. You'll notice that if you look at an Orthodox church, the dome it looks right. It looks proportional. This dome, it's like it's sitting on top of everything. You know, it's almost like on top of you, and it has this very intentional, imposing look, kind of frightful. So here's another example of what the whole square was supposed to look like. You know, thank God they never got a chance to build it. It's impressive, but it's very imposing. So a difference between communist and fascist movements when it comes to notions such as family and nation, for example. So communism tends to spit on the notion of family and nation. I have a little parentheses here. This doesn't work well, hence Stalin, which I'll explain in a minute. So communism spits on them, fascism plays on them. And I hope you can see the difference. Neither ultimately cares about them. So the communism is going to come along and say, you know, in order to make the new man, to reconstruct humanity itself, we have to tear down everything, you know, including we have to tear down the nation, which is why communism was always an international movement. It didn't really care. The ultimate goal was not the glory of one particular nation over another. It was to create this international utopian world, which was classless and without hierarchy. Of course, that never actually happened, but that was the philosophy. And so in order to do this, you actually have to start destroying the family itself, because the family was considered by Marx and Engels to be the first oppressive institution, because as soon as you're born into the family, there's already somebody above you. There's this natural hierarchy within the family itself. And of course, the family is the organic or the cell out of which the nation itself grows. So communism had this very negative attitude towards the family and towards the nation. It doesn't work very well because people don't like to have, they don't like this idea. In fact, when they brought people into these re-education camps in Romania, there's one called Pitești, which was particularly cruel, where they locked people up and they told them that they had to renounce their mother, renounce their father. They literally were told that they had to hate them. They had to renounce God. And they put them in these cells and they played these tapes over the loudspeakers, you know, there is no God over and over again and things like this. And so the idea was to destroy their souls, destroy the very love that they had for their father and their mother and their nation, you know, things that are very, very crucial to our well-being and identity. Okay, but this does not work very well, which is why Stalin actually understood this, and he began to reinstitute family values. Believe it or not, even a horrible dictator like Stalin realized that, you know, basically it wasn't working very, very well. So he strengthened the idea of family, childbearing to a certain degree. He lightened up on the church even, and allowed there to be more services within a limited capacity. But it's interesting. And of course, if you look at what ultimately ended up happening in Russia was they just brought back nationalism anyways, because it motivates people. You know, family and nation always motivate people, and the communist utopia idea ends up really demoralizing people. And so nevertheless, that idea, the ideology does always tend to negate those two things. Whereas again, fascism will tend to play on them. So fascism will use concepts like the family and the nation, but not because it ultimately cares about them, or rather it's all mixed up with these kind of negative ideas as well. So it uses them as a means to an end rather than actually caring. So I say here that both are opposed to the logos, because Christ transcends and includes all. They both want Christian virtues without Christ. So communism wants transcendence without Christ. Fascism wants identity without Christ. So just a second here. I want to speak a little bit about this idea of, because we're in this world right now where we see a resurgence of communism and fascism. So it's good to kind of dwell on this for a little bit. What do I mean by communism wants transcendence without Christ? So, communism is this idea to kind of create this new world. Well, Christianity offers to us the new world. Communism wants to create a new man. Christ is himself the new man, the second Adam, and he has offered us the real opportunity for the new world and the new creation. So communism wants to transcend things like gender, hierarchy, nations, all those things. The real communist philosophy is all about that. That's why nations don't really matter, gender doesn't really matter, family doesn't really matter, because we're going to transcend all these limitations. Well, ultimately, it's kind of a twisted way of trying to seek that which Christ already gives to us, which is transcendence of all these things, because we're not called to be limited by any of these things. All these things are good and proper in their own place, and yet Christ calls us to something more, which is why when the man said to Christ, can I first go and bury my father before I come and follow you? He said, let the dead bury their dead and come and follow me. And he said, except you hate father and mother, you cannot be my disciple. And he said all these kinds of things, which basically were trying to convey the idea that everything is good and proper in its own place, but God has to come first. There has to be the most important thing in your life has to be that which is transcending everything, which alone is God, who is the creator of everything. So it's basically, communism is trying to do that without Christ. Now, fascism is something which is always tied to the concept of identity, which is why whenever you see fascist movements, it's whether it was in Italy or Germany, and in fact, we see fascist movements popping up all across the world right now with surprising intensity. And they're all about identity. It's like, we are Ukrainians, we are Italians, we are Germans, we are Americans. There's a sense that, we are people of our family, of our clan, of our tribe, of our religion. Our nation is the best, nationalism ties into that. And so it's this real strong desire to have a really powerful sense of identity. But ultimately, it doesn't work because you can't have that without Christ. And that's why you see Europe has been falling apart for the last 50 years, and it will continue to disintegrate, because you really can't have France without Christ. You can't have Germany without Christ. You can't have Spain without Christ. Because if you take Christ out of it, who inspired the people that built those nations to begin with, then you're just left with, well, we wear different clothing and we eat different food. Well, and that's not enough. And then other people come in that still believe in transcendence, and they offer a more powerful message, and the civilization collapses. So now I think I might anticipate a question which, there's perhaps some of you might be thinking, if communism is really about transcendence, then how come on the left we see, for example, today, this real obsession with identity? It's known as identity politics. But what I would say to that is that the obsession isn't really with identity. In fact, identity is being used to destroy all sense of identity. So, someone identifies as this or identifies as that, but ultimately it's meant to break down any identity. So it's like, it doesn't even really mean anything to be a man anymore. It doesn't really mean anything to be a woman, because if you can just decide in your mind one day that you're this or that, it's ultimately a loss of identity. So it's kind of playing identities against one another with the ultimate goal of removing all identity. So again, that's that's desire for transcendence without Christ. All right, next slide. Okay, so here's an example of, this is a classroom in North Korea. I don't know if you can notice anything about it. It's very orderly. It certainly is sterile. There's not a lot of excess beauty going on. There's a little bit of color, which was nice of them to throw that in. But then again, I mean, this looks like a lot of college classrooms, to be honest. So here we have an image from an article called "What North Korea's Architecture Tells Us About Their Political Regime." So again, notice the blockiness of this. It looks like the inside of a computer. You've got these different buildings. They're all square. There's not a lot of domes or crosses ascending into the sky. There's not a lot of pointed buildings. Everything is kind of leveled off. Everything is neatly organized, and it kind of says something to you without using words. Notice also in the very center, you've got not people, which is very interesting. You don't have a statue of a person, which is often what you find in other places in Europe and in the United States, but you have instead these hands holding tools. This is very old-fashioned communist symbolism. The powerful workers who are rebuilding the world with their tools, the dictatorship of the proletariat. So again, that conveys a certain ethos, a certain idea. Probably there is a statue somewhere over there of Kim Jong-un, because he might be the only person who's allowed to be a person that has value. So here we have another example of fascist architecture. This is Mussolini. This is the headquarters of the fascist movement in Italy. And there's some nice buildings actually on either side. And you even have a nice little traditional statue there in the square. But then you have Mussolini's face, which is just kind of like plastered on this rather ugly background, which the S and the I symbolize the name for the fascist party of Italy, which I forgot actually off the top of my head. But it's interesting. So now we're going to touch upon the way that architecture expresses feminine and masculine modes of being. So here on the left, we have an Orthodox church. Here on the right, we have a communist apartment building. And I think you can guess which one expresses feminine qualities and which one expresses masculine qualities. It's pretty clear that the left expresses the feminine quality. So we're going to go into this a little deeper. The feminine approach is knowledge by union, mother and child, intuitive, subjective, experiential, emotional, mysterious, and religious. So, a child growing in its mother's womb is knowledge by union. The relationships, what you know about people that you can't even express with words. It's an experiential thing. It's knowing versus knowing about. Okay, so the masculine approach is more concerned with that which is outside oneself, the objective world, the analysis, to dissect, to control, the rational, the scientific perspective. So it's not about bad or good, because God has given us both of these things, but it's about how they manifest themselves in the world, and they're meant to work together in harmony. Nevertheless, the church tells us that interior knowledge by union should occupy the highest place. So something to keep in mind. In the modern world, we actually see the triumph of the masculine. We live in an age which is actually very much determined by masculine values. And I know this kind of runs against the current of often the right wing and conservative critique of our times, which is that everybody's too soft and feminine and so forth. But Carl Stern, who's a famous psychologist, who is a deep thinker and a Christian, would definitely disagree, and he would suggest, and I agree with him, that we're living in an excessively masculine age. And we see this in the architecture. It's reflected very clearly. Now, the thing about living at a masculine age is that you don't need to be masculine in a masculine age because it's kind of taken care of for you. It's actually in the ancient world, which was not a masculine, that you really needed men to kind of rise up and to become, to exhibit those masculine values. Anyways, there's an interesting inverse proportion paradox that goes along with that. So again, here's a city skyline. You can see it's dominated by more sharp corners, which tends to be more of a masculine thing, squares, and that sort of thing. So if you look at this architecture, on the other hand, it's actually very feminine, all the more illustrating that the modern age is the triumph of the masculine. So again, you can contrast the two for yourself. Here we have St. Basil's Cathedral. It's full of these round shapes. It's colorful. It's also suggesting to us the transcendent. It's calling us to unite with God intuitively, experientially. And here we have, by contrast, the modern city on the right. And you just see, look at all the squares. It's everything is neatly stacked. Everything is in order. But where's the transcendence? What is calling us to the experiential? Not much. So here's another example of this. So this is from the book Flight from Woman by Carl Stern. And he says, the artist's knowledge of a creature is contrary to the scientist's subjective. That is a personal experience not confined to pure description. It is an interior knowledge, not achieved by breaking up and disassembling, but by union and incorporation. It is a primary form of knowledge related to the world which unite child and mother. You might say that the scientist knows more about the rabbit than the painter, but the painter knows better about the rabbit than the scientist. And then he used an example from a play, a line from a play that says, Faust knew 1,000 times more than Margaret, but she knew 1,000 times better than he. So I hope you can kind of see the difference there. To know about is not the same thing as to know. So for example, a scientist might be able to explain to you your wife or your husband or your child or your parents, the structure of their body, how many bones they have, how their DNA, what their DNA sequence looks like, the chromosomes involved in bringing their body into existence, the cardiovascular system, how their eyes work, how their brain works, how many cells are in their body. But that's just knowledge about them. That doesn't, you're the one that actually knows them. You know who they really are. Even if you don't know anything about, even if you can't explain, their cardiovascular system or how many cells are in their body, you know them by experience. It's a different kind of knowledge. And I'm not suggesting that the scientific form of knowledge is in any way wrong. It's just a different kind of knowledge. And it's actually the less important kind, ultimately, in a spiritual sense, in terms of priorities. So it is a primary form of knowledge, this is Carl Stern again, related to the world which unite child and mother. And so here we have a beautiful example of the Mother of God with the Christ child. And, they have this connection, the connection which is between mother and child. It's a kind of true knowledge. It's not about the skin, the eyes, in that purely physical sense. It's not about how many beats per minute is the heart beating, how many cells are in the brain. That's different. That's a different kind of knowledge, which has its place. It's really about experience, intuition, and that deep kind of knowing. So, moving quite right along here. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the two novels, 1984 and Brave New World. These are two dystopian novels that offer differing views about what the future might hold. So this is an interesting quote I came across. I think it's worth reflecting on. Very interestingly, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner there, and you look at the book 1984, George Orwell, this is some of the original artwork. Notice the buildings. Do you see the squares? You see them all kind of stacked together there. It's actually very much like the North Korean buildings, which I must add, at least they gave them some color. You know, that was a nice touch by the regime. But I kind of thought it was a striking parallel there. And then you see on the right side, you see the artwork for A Brave New World, and you see that the man who, notice what he doesn't have. He doesn't have a head. So again, here's two different takes on a possible future. What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared that the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared that we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared that we would become a trivial culture, preoccupied with some equivalent of the feelies, the orgy-porgy, and the centrifugal bumble puppy. As Huxley remarked in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever alert to oppose tyranny failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. So in 1984, Orwell added, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that we would, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. So different takes on the possible future. It appears that Huxley's view fits well with Western Europe and North America, and Orwell's view fits more with the Eastern Hemisphere. Not sure where South America fits in, for example. The capitalist nations of the West seek to distract us with pleasure and trivial pursuits, whereas places like China and other Eastern nations, control is achieved through direct suppression of information and freedom. However, even here in the West, we see an increasing use of fear that can be used to bring about the worst in us and keep us from thinking clearly. However, Christ calls us to move beyond simply being constantly tossed about by the pursuit of pleasure and the fear of pain. So he kind of delivers us from the plight of the Huxleyan world and the Orwellian world. And he calls us as the logos of truth out of this worldly approach to life of being tossed to and fro by the winds of desire. So here's a wonderful quote from the book, Christ the Eternal Tao. Desiring to escape pain, we seek refuge in sensual pleasure, calling it by the name of happiness. But in trying to blunt the pain with pleasure, we but increase our pain. For pleasure and pain are intertwined. Therefore did the ancient sage cry, O misery, happiness lies by its side. O happiness, misery lurks beneath it. Wherever there is pleasure, there must be pain. There must be pain, for through pain we have not chosen. The way, that is Christ, turns us from the illusory pleasure we have chosen. Pain forces us to rise above the realm of the senses and to live according to our true nature, our original designation. Pleasure of the senses is emptiness ever filling itself, yet remaining ever empty. Pleasure of the soul is fullness ever emptying itself, yet remaining ever full. Our Lord breaks the chains that hold us captive to the cycle of pleasure and pain, calling us to assume our true nature. We should therefore neither be manipulated by the fear of the Orwellian world or the pleasure of the Huxleyan world. So we've been experiencing lately a breakdown in our society, and there's kind of a new restless emptiness that seems to affect us. And we're glued to these devices, computers like we're on now, phones, televisions, and this becomes our predominant window into the world. But it is a false window. In fact, it really is an anti-icon, because instead of being a window into heaven, it is more often than not a window into hell. I don't know, for those of you who aren't familiar with the idea that icons are considered windows into heaven. So this window into hell that we're often looking into often condenses, catalogs, compounds, and expands the very worst in us for us to consume endlessly, only provoking more fear and pleasure seeking. But Christ shared in our nature and partook of death that he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. So in Christ we have deliverance from this endless cycle. So here's some encouraging words from Elder Thaddeus of Serbia. He says that our thoughts create either harmony or disharmony in the world. So as we work on our interior cleansing, we're actually doing the best thing we can do to help the world. We do the greatest work in bringing about its healing. The church is called to be that part of the world which is redeemed and healed, and therefore a tithe of the world to God who made it. So our own internal harmony is actually what brings that external harmony. St. Maximus the Confessor says, Christ overcame the law of pleasure and pain that ruled over mankind from the time of the fall. So he delivers us from that endless cycle of being tossed from the fire into the water, like the young possessed boy in the gospel. So the exterior world is always going to reflect our own interior state. And again, we've just seen so many examples of that in the pictures from the fascist regimes and the communist regimes, and then contrasting that with the church. We make the exterior world reflect what's going on inside. So here's a quote from St. John of Kronstadt. He says, "How is it that all nature and everything in nature is so wisely arranged and moves in such wonderful order? It is because the Creator himself directs and governs it. How is it that in the nature of man, the crown of creation, there is so much disorder? Why are there so many irregularities and deformities in his life?" And he gives the answer. Because he took upon himself to direct and govern himself against the will and wisdom of his Creator. So here's a beautiful picture of the Yorkshire Dales, where the buildings were made from local materials, creating a unique landscape where man-made blends with the natural, and it also works best for the harsh conditions that are found there. So this is taken from the book Harmony, which is a really fascinating book by Prince Charles of Wales. Great example there of how architecture, even very simple architecture, can be used in a way that it works harmoniously with the environment around it. There's nothing in this picture that kind of makes you want to turn away. It doesn't look unnatural in its context. All right, now back to architecture. So, in contrast to the blocks of modernity, enter the mystery. Here the message is, I am an image of the ineffable glory, though I bear the marks of transgressions. This is taken from the Panikhida service. So, what do we notice? Notice the circles everywhere. There's just circles all over the place, in contrast to the blocks of the communist architecture. So these circles are conveying something to us, right? It's drawing us in. So both the exterior of this church and its interior, they're saying, you are something more. You are part of the image of the ineffable glory. Your true nature, your true calling is to be found by looking towards God. It's calling you towards your true home. And so this architectural manifestation it's reflecting that belief and that experience. It's reflecting the inner state of human souls by creating this amazing, beautiful temple. And it's just everything about it is where it should be. It has squares, it has octagons, it has other shapes, but it all coalesces and brings you up towards he who reigns, the Pantocrator over all things. Breathtakingly beautiful church. So in traditional architecture, we see that God is respected by the architect, you are respected by the architect, and nature, the creation itself, is reflected in the design. Beauty is considered not a waste of time, but rather as something essential to what it means to be human. This is what happens when a person acknowledges that the spirit, or nous, has first place in our humanity. So this is a picture from inside of Sagrada Familia, which is designed by the architect Gaudi. This is in, I believe, Barcelona in Spain. It's been in construction for 150 years, and it still is in construction to this day. And he was an interesting architect who fasted and prayed a lot. He was a devout Roman Catholic, and he took his inspiration from nature itself. And he actually wanted this church to reflect the experience of being in a forest and looking up, and you see the light coming through the trees. So you can kind of see that. And I gave an example here of the parallels there. So you can see how much similarity there is between standing in the cathedral and standing in the forest. You know, it's pretty amazing, actually. So he was literally, as an architect, listening to the cues of the great architect, the chief one, which is God himself. So I want to reflect a little bit on, even outside of Christianity, we see this. C.S. Lewis says that there is this thing called the Tao, or the way. And he talks about this in his book, The Abolition of Man, and a few others places. He said that there is a set of objective values that have been shared with minor differences by every culture, which he refers to as the traditional moralities of East and West, the Christian, the pagan, and the Jew. And he calls this the Tao. So he recognized that even in Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, you can see this idea that there is this greater transcendence. You know, there is this something more. And so the architecture itself reflects that. It reflects being pointed upward. It doesn't confine us simply to this world. So that's important to recognize. He also said what we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men with nature as its instrument. So, you know, it's kind of all in how you decide to look at things. You know, are these human beings who work, or are these workers? You know, it's a different way of looking at things. Are these trees that can be felled, or is it just lumber? You know, you could look at those trees and you could say, I see lumber. Well, you know, that's one way of looking at things. So here we have a wonderful example of just kind of the micro universe versus the macro universe. These are single-celled algae here on the left. There's 10,000 different species. And then we have a Hubble shot of the universe. And so you see the same hand of the creator at work at the micro level, which we can't even see with the naked eye, and then at the macro level. This is something I thought was interesting. The laminin is what holds most of the cells in our body together. So it's in a very interesting shape. It's kind of like a cross. And it looks almost identical to St. Nino's cross. And St. Nino was the founder of the nation of Georgia. I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing. I thought I'd throw it in there. So Archimandrite Vasilios of Nantathos says something which I think is worth reflecting upon. He says, beauty is not a mere category of aesthetics, but rather it is the divine grace and energy which holds together the universe. So that's a very different take on beauty than we would hear in the typical university, where it's merely is a category of aesthetics. You know, it's to study beauty and kind of like how do you create beautiful lines and architecture and art and so forth. But he's saying, no, it's not just that. It is beauty itself is the grace and energy which holds together the universe. So it's a very, very different take. So I asked the question, is our present course wise? Well, I think we know the answer. Here we have Dubai on the left. If you're wondering what city that is, that's the city that's in the United Arab Emirates, which, by the way, was built by slave labor. That's a fact. And then we have a bird on the right, and we can see that the bird is filled with trash. So some sobering reflections there. And here we have another great quote from William Shakespeare, who says, "There are more things in heaven and on earth, Horatio, that are dreamt of in your philosophy." So that's a wonderful critique of the ideologies which would seek to reduce us and reduce our planet. So again, noetic architecture. Love of all creation. This is from the brothers Karamazov. Love all creation, the whole of it, and every grain of sand within it. Love every leaf, every ray of God's light. Love the animals, love the plants, love everything. If you love everything, you will perceive the divine mystery in things. And that is indeed the point, to perceive the divine mystery in things. So, this is an important book written by Philip Sherrard, who I quoted at the beginning of the class, called Human Image, World Image, The Death and Resurrection of Sacred Cosmology. And he says that the revolutionary changes in mental outlook that took place in Western Christendom 4 centuries ago and that produced the modern scientific movement are the major cause of the crisis in which we find ourselves today. And I'm not going to read the entire quote, but it's basically, he says that, unfortunately, because of the cause that or the path that we chose to go down of neglecting the spirit as coming first in our lives and going down this purely materialistic scientific road, we end up with this, what he calls a vast collective lie. And it's a rather sobering quote. And he says, whose ramification in the major spheres of our thoughts and action cannot but vandalize and desecrate both ourselves and the world we live in. So let's not do that. Restoring the icon. Man is worthy of being loved just because he's in the image of God. It doesn't matter at all if he's good or bad, moral or sinful. Man is worthy of being loved for what he is. Christ loved and sacrificed himself for sinful, corrupt people. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. So this is St. Paisios. He says, we should be the same way. We should love everyone without making any distinctions. Just like the sun rises on everyone, intelligent and unintelligent, good and evil, beautiful and ugly, our love should be like the love of God. Love that's like the sun and shines on his whole creation without making distinctions. And so here we see the restoration of the fallen man. We have on the bottom this wonderful statue that kind of shows man as this lost wanderer upon the earth, bent over and in despair. And on the top we have this icon of Christ, the new Adam, who's restored his fallen image. And so we'll end here with this quote from St. John of Damascus, who says, the whole earth is a living icon of the face of God. Each person is an icon, and the whole earth is an icon of the Creator. And he says, I do not worship matter, I worship the God of matter, who became matter for my sake. It's a beautiful quote from St. John of Damascus. If you ever get a chance to go to the cathedral in Santa Rosa, there's a beautiful icon of St. John, and he has that exact quote on the scroll that he's holding. So this is the last slide. And at this point, I'll take questions that you've submitted. I know we've covered a lot.